Imagine a courtroom so silent you can hear people holding their breath. The judge leans forward, expecting a short answer, maybe a safe one. Instead, Johnny Depp pauses, looks up, and delivers a response so raw, so honest, that it changes the temperature of the entire room. This wasn't about winning a case. This wasn't about fame or headlines. This was about truth, about pain carried quietly for years, and about a moment where words finally mattered. What he said didn't just answer a question, it exposed a lifetime. And once you hear it, you won't forget it. The pause felt longer than it probably was. A few seconds stretched into something heavier, something loaded with meaning. Johnny Depp didn't rush to speak. He didn't look at his lawyers. He didn't perform. He simply stood there, breathing, as if weighing not just words but memories. The kind that don't fade, the kind that sit quietly in the back of your mind until someone asks the wrong question at the wrong time. The judge had asked something simple on the surface, the kind of question that usually gets a rehearsed response. But this time, the answer didn't come from strategy. It came from somewhere much deeper. He looked down for a moment, almost like he was grounding himself. And when he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, controlled, and unmistakably real. He said that harm doesn't always look the way people expect it to look. Sometimes it isn't bruises or broken bones. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's watching someone you love endure pain and realizing, years later, how much of that pain became your own. The courtroom shifted, people adjusted in their seats. Even those who had heard countless testimonies before sensed that this was different. Johnny began talking about his childhood, not as a story designed to gain sympathy, but as context. He spoke about growing up in a home where tension was normal, where love and fear lived side by side. He didn't blame, he didn't accuse, he simply described. And that simplicity made it impossible to ignore. He talked about his father, a man who carried his own struggles quietly. A man who, despite everything, chose silence over confrontation. Johnny explained that as a child, he didn't understand that choice. He thought silence meant weakness. He thought staying meant accepting. But as he grew older, as life tested him in ways he never expected, he began to understand the complexity behind that silence. Sometimes people stay quiet not because they have nothing to say, but because they are trying to protect what little peace remains. The judge listened without interrupting. The room listened too. Johnny described how witnessing that dynamic shaped him, how it taught him to absorb pain rather than express it, how it trained him to believe that enduring was the same as being strong. He admitted that for a long time he confused tolerance with love and patience with survival. These weren't lines from a script, they were realizations spoken out loud for the first time. He said that when people ask why he didn't react sooner, why he didn't speak louder, why he didn't walk away faster, they are asking the wrong question. The real question, he explained, is what happens to a person who learns early on that silence is safer than noise? What happens when your default response to conflict is to retreat inward, to wait it out, to hope it passes? That lesson doesn't disappear just because you grow older or more successful. His words weren't rushed. They flowed like someone finally allowing themselves to say what they had rehearsed internally for years. He acknowledged his flaws without hesitation. He said he wasn't perfect, never claimed to be. But he was honest about one thing. He never wanted to become the source of fear he once witnessed. That fear shaped his decisions, his reactions, and his restraint. The judge's expression softened, not in judgment but in recognition. This wasn't a performance. This was a man explaining the architecture of his inner world. Johnny spoke about how emotional harm often hides behind closed doors, invisible to outsiders. How people are quick to judge outcomes without understanding origins. He said that pain doesn't always explode. Sometimes it erodes slowly, quietly, until you don't recognize yourself anymore. He paused again, just briefly, and added that speaking now wasn't easy. That opening old wounds never is. But he believed there was value in honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. He said that for years he stayed quiet because that's what he knew. Because that's what felt familiar. But silence, he learned, can protect you only for so long before it starts to cost you pieces of yourself. The courtroom felt smaller, more intimate. It no longer felt like a legal proceeding. It felt like a moment of human truth unfolding in real time. Johnny explained that being asked whether he was harmed forced him to confront a lifetime of normalized pain. And the answer wasn't a simple yes or no. Harm, he said, isn't always immediate. Sometimes it reveals itself years later, in patterns, in choices, in the way you respond to love and conflict. He talked about accountability, about owning his mistakes without surrendering his truth. He emphasized that telling your story doesn't mean erasing others, it means finally acknowledging your own experience. For a long time, he said, he believed that enduring silently was noble. But he realized that silence can also enable misunderstanding, and misunderstanding can grow into something far bigger than the truth. His voice wavered for the first time, not breaking, just softening. He said that what hurt the most wasn't the accusations or the headlines. It was seeing his children, his family, and even strangers form opinions without knowing the full story. That kind of pain doesn't scream. It settles, it lingers, it changes how you see the world. The judge remained quiet, allowing the moment to breathe. Johnny continued, explaining that the question of harm opened a door he had kept closed for decades. Behind it were memories he had learned to minimize, to rationalize. He said that acknowledging them now wasn't about rewriting the past, it was about understanding the present. He spoke about resilience, not as a badge of honor but as a survival mechanism. How people praise strength without realizing how often it's born from necessity, not choice. He said that many people endure because they don't see an alternative, not because they are unbreakable. And that distinction matters. As he spoke, the courtroom seemed to forget time. There were no murmurs, no shifting papers, just attention. Johnny made it clear that he wasn't seeking pity, he was seeking clarity. Clarity for himself, and perhaps for anyone watching who had ever questioned their own reactions to pain. He said that being asked that question by the judge felt like a mirror being held up to his life. And for the first time, he didn't look away, he didn't deflect, he faced it. He admitted that yes, he had been harmed, but not in the way people imagine. He was harmed by learning to stay silent, harmed by believing that enduring was the only option, harmed by mistaking quiet suffering for peace. He ended this part of his answer by saying that truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives gently, after years of avoidance, asking to be acknowledged. And when it does, you have a choice. You can turn away again, or you can finally listen. The room stayed silent even after he stopped speaking, not because anyone was stunned, but because no one wanted to rush past what had just been said. It was the kind of silence that follows something honest, something that doesn't need applause or reaction, just understanding. And in that silence, it became clear that this wasn't just an answer to a legal question. It was the beginning of something else, a reckoning, a realization, a moment where the past and present collided, setting the stage for everything that would come next. Johnny took another breath, slower this time, as if he was aware that once he continued, there was no pulling the words back. He explained that silence becomes a language of its own. When you live with it long enough, it starts speaking for you. People interpret your quiet in ways you never intended. They project motives, weakness, guilt, and eventually, those projections become louder than your actual voice. He said that for years, he watched that happen to him, not just in private relationships but on a public stage magnified beyond control. He talked about how fame complicates pain, how suffering doesn't pause just because cameras are present. If anything, it becomes harder to process because every reaction is dissected. Every expression is analyzed. He said that when you grow up learning to internalize pain, public scrutiny doesn't teach you to fight back. It teaches you to retreat even further, to disappear emotionally while remaining physically present. The judge asked nothing, there was no need. Johnny continued on his own, explaining that he often questioned himself more than anyone else ever could. Self-doubt, he said, becomes second nature when you are trained early to believe that conflict is something to endure rather than resolve. He spoke about nights spent replaying conversations, wondering what he could have done differently, how he could have softened himself further to avoid escalation. And that constant self-interrogation, he admitted, slowly erodes your sense of self. He clarified that emotional harm isn't about assigning villains, it's about acknowledging impact. You can love someone and still be hurt by them. You can stay loyal and still lose parts of yourself. Those truths, he said, are uncomfortable because they don't fit into simple narratives. People prefer clear heroes and clear villains. Real life rarely offers that clarity. Johnny shared that for a long time, he believed speaking up would only create more damage. That silence felt like the lesser evil, but over time, he realized that silence doesn't freeze reality. It distorts it. When you don't tell your story, someone else will, and they may not tell it with care. They may not tell it with truth, but their version will fill the space you left empty. He said that realization didn't come overnight. It came slowly, through loss, through reflection, through watching relationships fracture under the weight of unspoken truths. He admitted that there were moments when he wished he had spoken sooner, but he also acknowledged that he wasn't ready then. Readiness, he said, isn't about courage alone, It's about understanding yourself well enough to articulate what happened without losing yourself in the process. The courtroom felt less like a place of judgment and more like a place of witnessing. Johnny spoke about therapy, about confronting patterns he didn't realize he was repeating. How the past doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It waits, it resurfaces, often in the most intimate spaces of your life. He said that recognizing those patterns was painful but necessary, because without recognition, there is no change. He addressed the idea of strength again, challenging the way society defines it. Strength, he said, isn't just endurance. Sometimes strength is interruption, interrupting cycles, interrupting silence, interrupting the story you were taught to live inside. But interruption requires awareness, and awareness often arrives through discomfort. He acknowledged that people watching might still disagree with him, and he accepted that. Truth, he said, doesn't require universal approval. It requires honesty, and honesty doesn't guarantee understanding. It only guarantees that you are no longer lying to yourself. Johnny reflected on the moment the judge asked the question, saying it felt deceptively simple. But simple questions often expose the most complicated answers. Being asked whether he was harmed forced him to stop minimizing his own experience. It forced him to stop comparing his pain to others as if suffering were a competition. He said pain doesn't need to be the worst to be real. It just needs to exist. He talked about how people often dismiss emotional harm because it leaves no visible scars. But invisibility doesn't equal insignificance. Some wounds shape your entire life without ever being seen. They influence how you trust, how you love, how you defend yourself. And pretending they don't exist doesn't make them disappear. It only gives them more power. His voice steadied again as he spoke about responsibility. He made it clear that acknowledging harm doesn't absolve you of your own actions. Two things can coexist. You can be hurt and still make mistakes. You can be damaged and still be accountable. Recognizing one doesn't erase the other. That balance, he said, is something he continues to work on. The judge finally shifted slightly but still said nothing. Johnny took that as permission to finish his thought. He said that answering honestly in that moment felt like reclaiming something. Not control over the narrative but control over himself. For the first time, he wasn't speaking to defend, deny, or deflect. He was speaking to explain. He admitted that the aftermath of silence can be just as painful as the events that caused it. Watching misunderstandings grow, watching trust dissolve, watching your character be questioned while you remain quiet takes a toll. And eventually, the weight of that silence becomes heavier than the fear of speaking. Johnny said that if there was one thing he hoped people would take from his answer, it was this. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is just unexpressed pain waiting for acknowledgement, and acknowledging it doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest. He ended his response without a dramatic conclusion. No grand statement, just a quiet certainty. He said that being harmed taught him the cost of staying silent, and being asked about it taught him the value of finally speaking. And whatever the outcome, that truth was something he could stand by. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't heavy with anticipation. It was full of meaning, full of reflection. And in that moment, it was clear that the question had done more than seek an answer. It had opened a door that could never fully be closed again. That moment didn't belong only to the courtroom. It belonged to anyone who had ever questioned their own silence, anyone who had ever wondered whether enduring quietly was the same as being strong. And as Johnny stood there, having said what he needed to say, it was evident that this was not the end of the story. It was only the turning point. After that turning point, everything felt different, even though nothing visible had changed. Johnny stood there knowing that once words leave your mouth, they don't belong to you anymore. They travel, they get interpreted, misunderstood, debated. But for the first time, that didn't scare him. He had already lived through the worst part, the part where truth stays trapped inside. Whatever came next, at least it would be built on honesty. He explained that people often assume silence means consent or acceptance. But in his experience, silence was survival. It was a way to keep things from getting worse, a way to keep the fragile balance intact. He said that when you grow up watching someone absorb pain quietly, you learn that speaking up has consequences. Not always immediate but lasting, and those lessons don't disappear when you become an adult. They embed themselves in your instincts. Johnny talked about how memory works, how certain moments stay vivid while others blur. He said that when he reflected on his life, he could see a pattern of choosing endurance over confrontation. Not because he lacked a voice, but because he learned early on that using it could shatter everything. That belief shaped his relationships, his boundaries, and even the way he saw himself. He acknowledged that from the outside, his life looked charmed. Success, recognition, opportunity. But pain doesn't check bank accounts or reputations before showing up. Emotional wounds don't dissolve under bright lights. If anything, he said, they hide better. Because people assume you have no right to struggle when you appear to have everything. He spoke about isolation, how it can exist even in crowded rooms. How being surrounded by people doesn't mean being understood. Sometimes it makes things worse because you feel pressure to perform stability. To smile through discomfort, to convince everyone, including yourself, that you're fine. He said that act becomes exhausting over time. Johnny reflected on how difficult it is to explain emotional harm to someone who hasn't lived it. Words feel insufficient, comparisons feel unfair, and often, you stop trying because it feels easier to stay misunderstood than to risk being dismissed. He admitted that there were moments when he questioned whether his pain even counted. Whether he was overreacting, whether he should just be grateful and move on. That internal conflict, he said, is one of the most damaging parts. When you invalidate your own experience long enough, you lose trust in your perceptions. You start outsourcing your reality to others, and once that happens, reclaiming your sense of self becomes incredibly hard. He said the courtroom question forced him to stop doing that. It forced him to say, out loud, that his experience mattered to him, even if others disagreed. And that act alone felt like resistance against years of self-doubt. Johnny talked about forgiveness, but not in the way people expect. He said forgiveness isn't about excusing harm or pretending it didn't happen. It's about releasing yourself from carrying it alone. Sometimes forgiveness begins with simply naming what hurt you, not to punish anyone but to free yourself from silence. He admitted that there were days he still struggled with guilt. Guilt for speaking, guilt for not speaking sooner, guilt for the people affected by the fallout, but he said guilt is often the companion of honesty. It shows up when you step out of old roles and into unfamiliar ground. And learning to live with that guilt is part of growth. He emphasized that telling the truth doesn't guarantee resolution. It doesn't fix relationships overnight. It doesn't rewrite the past. But it does create a starting point, a place where reality can finally exist without being buried. Johnny also addressed the idea of public opinion. He said once a narrative forms, it becomes hard to challenge. People latch onto what confirms their beliefs and ignore what complicates them. He understood that some would never change their minds, and he made peace with that. Truth, he said, isn't a popularity contest. What mattered to him was that his children would one day understand that their father chose honesty over comfort. That he chose to speak even when it was easier to stay quiet. That legacy, he said, meant more than any headline. He described how that moment in court stayed with him long after. Not because of the reaction, but because of the internal shift it created. He felt lighter, not because the pain disappeared, but because he was no longer hiding it from himself. Acknowledging it made it manageable. Silence had made it heavier. Johnny said that many people live their entire lives carrying unspoken pain, believing it's normal, believing it's their burden alone. And he hoped that by answering honestly, someone watching might feel less alone. Might recognize themselves in that silence. Might realize that their pain doesn't need permission to be real. He clarified again that his answer wasn't an accusation. It was an explanation of how harm can be subtle, cumulative, and deeply influential. How it shapes your instincts without announcing itself, and how recognizing it is the first step toward breaking its hold. The courtroom eventually moved on. Questions continued, procedures resumed, but that moment lingered. It lingered because it wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't strategic, it was human, and in a place designed for arguments and evidence, humanity stood out. Johnny concluded his thoughts by saying that if he had learned anything, it was this. Silence might protect you in the moment, but it rarely protects you in the long run. Speaking your truth may be uncomfortable, but it gives you something silence never can. Agency. And as he finished, there was no dramatic reaction, no gasp, no applause, just understanding, the kind that settles quietly, the kind that stays with you long after the room empties. That answer didn't just leave the judge speechless. It left a mark, not because it was shocking, but because it was honest. And honesty, when it finally arrives, has a way of changing everything. If this moment made you pause, if it stirred something you couldn't quite name, don't ignore that feeling. Stories like this matter because they remind us we're not alone in our silence. If you believe truth deserves space, if you believe honesty still has power, then stay connected. Like, share, and follow for more real stories that go beyond headlines. Your voice matters, and sometimes, hearing someone else speak is the first step toward finding your own.